can start with the morning session. Thank you very much.
So, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all back. I would like to ask you to take your cards. The delegates should have their cards, and I hope you have brought them with you. Can you show them to me? Oh, wonderful. But not everybody. Well, this is going to be decisive later this afternoon, but we will practice this a little bit. I will say a bit more about the use of these cards later this afternoon. But for the moment, I just have a question to some of you. And we remember, orange is I'm warm to the thought. I feel comfortable with this. I can agree with this. And the blue card means I'm cold to this. I cannot agree with this yet. Maybe I need more clarification. And if you cross the cards, you're basically saying, I am not there. I want to ask. I think the business has gone. We need to interrupt this a little bit and to stop this for a moment and to reflect on where we are and what are the options. Okay. How was your trip yesterday? I think it was a good trip to the pyramids. Was it a good trip to the pyramids? I see orange cards. I see no blue cards. So it looks like there is a consensus on this matter. How was the trip to the monasteries? Wow, orange cards. So look around for yourself. You see the orange cards. No blue cards? No hunger? No thirst? Yesterday? Oh, some were hungry, but they forgot about it now after this lovely dinner last night. Well, my proposal is, if you stand up here, to ask the people to cool down the room. What's your feeling about that? Oh, not everybody is in favor of that. Not everybody is in favor of that. Cool down the room. No further clarifications needed? Okay. Yes, there is somebody with a double card there, a cross card. What is your question? The young lady in the back? You crossed your cards? Or was it a mistake?
My cards, if they could
just the micro is with you. I can't hear you from here.
Thank you, moderator. If they do indeed cool down the room, can they just not make it ice cold?
Okay. So a little bit colder, a little bit fresher. Some are warm to that. Not everybody is warm to that. Well, we will ask the technicians, this is now my proposal, what they can do about it to make a median things. I think for now, this is sufficient. We will do this again a few times today so that you get some sense. So bring your cards. If you don't have them, there are sufficient cards. You can pick them up outside the hall. So please bring them to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator, for this orientation. Just before we start, I would like to remind us that, as it has been communicated at the very beginning in the opening plenary of our event, that each of these days we have a particular focal point as we address the core theme of our World Conference, We Are Now for Visible Unity. So on Saturday, our focal point was on faith, and today it is on mission. And when the Cultural Assembly in 2022 affirmed the plans for the World Conference, The Assembly asked the Faith and Order Commission to work in close collaboration with the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism in preparing for the World Conference. And I'm very proud and pleased to say that today's program in particular was developed in close collaboration with the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism. And among us we have the moderator of the Commission who will participate in the plenary after this one, but also leadership of the Commission who are also sharing these days with us. So in particular I would like to acknowledge them, but also to acknowledge our dear friend and colleague, Reverend Dr. Peter Cruchley, the Director of the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism, with whom we worked closely in shaping today's program. Our friend Peter passed away this year in August 15, just a bit 2 months ago. And I would kindly ask you that we remember him, that we remember his family, his wife Lena, his daughters Enfys and Larry in our prayers. And I ask God that his memory be eternal. Thank you. Moderator, over to you.
Thank you so much, our director and Miriam, for taking us through the consensus process, reminding us what we're supposed to do. May Peter's soul rest in peace. Welcome everyone to our plenary session on the theme, the Church in and for the World. Today we are privileged to begin with 3 inspiring keynote speeches. Unfortunately, our first speaker, the Reverend Dr. Steptemi Lakawa, could not join us in person. However, we are delighted to share a recorded address which will be presented to us shortly. Let's prepare to engage with their insights, ask our questions, and please, if you have any question as every speaker is speaking or any speaker is speaking, please scan the QR code there and all the questions will come to us, and at the right time we will read them to the speakers and they will respond accordingly. So allow me to introduce the Reverend Dr. Steptemi Lakawa in absentia, who is the president of Jakarta Theological Seminary in Indonesia. She received a PhD from Boston University School of Theology. Her research interests are on interreligious dialogue and trauma, theology, and interreligious aesthetics in the aftermath of religious communal violence. She's worked with several local congregations and a seminary to develop poetic and meditative dance as a form of doing Christian theological aesthetics in a multi-religious context. Omitia, please play Stephanie's address. Thank you.
Greetings in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. It is with a joyful and humble heart that I share my theological view on this panel's theme of the Church in and for the world. Although I'm very sorry to miss the opportunity to be part of this historic ecumenical fellowship in person with all of you, I am grateful to the conference committee for inviting me to record my presentation. Over this past year, in preparing for this conference, many have asked deep, challenging, complex, and perhaps in some way similar questions, and have shared reflections on identifying and reflecting on the significance and relevance of the First Nicene Council 1700 years after it took place. The socio-political context of the Nicene Council was a time in which churches were surviving persecution and perhaps being traumatized, yet gaining public and political status throughout the empire under Constantinople. Thus, it is likely that the First Ecumenical Council pointed toward a paradoxical space, that of trauma and survival, of the spiritual and the political, of theology and politics, of faith and powers. Perhaps we are still in such a paradoxical space 1700 years later. The question, however, is this: how are we different from the Nicene Council in how we embody the ecumenical vision and how we exercise ecumenical leadership? Further, how much do Nicaea and Egypt, which is the site of this conference, so many centuries later have in common? Theologically, both sides point to the dimension that the question about the church in and for the world implies. It is about the space, the spatiality of being ecumenical, the where, the location, the context of being church in and for the world. After 1700 years, are we now embodying a different kind of ecumenical fellowship and ecumenical leadership, a different way of being ecumenical? The title of my presentation is "Do This in Remembrance of Ruptured Me." I inserted the word rupture. It means more than being broken or brokenness. It is to signify the one whose very identity was the center of the Nicene Council. However, this is not a Christological discourse on the divinity and humanity of Jesus Christ. The insertion of the word rupture paradoxically aims to remind us of our call to be church in and for the world. My question, however, is this: what if being church today also means being against the world that is being taken over by contesting megapowers in a new showcase of the violent hierarchy of global empires that signal the dawn of a cosmic catastrophe? This is the same world that is ruled by the powers that be that continue to play God. It is a world that celebrates ignorance and hatred and succumbs to violent powers rather than challenging, resisting, and collaborating across differences to bring justice and healing, starting from the ruptured places of the hungry, the sick, the imprisoned, the terrorized. It is a world where sufferings are ranked in a new hierarchy, where one's history of violence often becomes a norm rather than a reference, a mirror, a reflection, or a resonance for condemning new forms of existential dehumanization through genocide, war, hatred, and ignorance. My use of the concept of after in the term afterlife in the subtitle of this speech, an afterlife ecumenical posture, is inspired by Palestinian liberation theologies, in which, according to Graham McGill in his introduction to the book Theology After Gaza, the meaning of after has always been spatial. Furthermore, adding to the spatiality, I use the concept of afterlife in reference to Shelley Rambo's theological rethinking of resurrection from a trauma perspective to show the persistence of life from within the, quote, ongoingness of forces of violence, end of quote. As an Indonesian feminist mission theologian, my theological voice has primarily been shaped by Indonesia and how I understand the Bible and Christian faith from within and towards that context. However, as a participant in the global ecumenical fellowship, I have always kept the context of Indonesian churches as a part of my ecumenical and critical self-reflexive missional voice and posture. I use three analogies of the afterlife theological posture as an ecumenical ruptured posture. Each posture is retold from a particular space that leads to interconnected special postures that I offer as a response to the questions of how we remember Nicaea today, but also the question of where do we remember it from. First, the breaking of bread from Luke 24, verses 30 to 31, the unmasking of fear and terror. The road to Emmaus is the story of two disciples' traumatic journey in the aftermath of the Lord's passing. It is also about a journey of survival. Witnessing and surviving the death of their beloved unmasked their own wounds, embedded in fear and uncertainty, and the decision they made to leave Jerusalem, the site of violence and trauma. It is also a journey of facing, naming, and thus unmasking the terror of fear that clouded their minds and hearts, and that resulted in their failure to recognize the presence of the resurrected Lord. Matthew Raheb, a Lutheran Palestinian liberation theologian, in his and Graham McGill's edited book, Theology After Gaza, a global anthology, especially in Raheb's chapter titled Theology After Gaza, Political Context and Theological Challenge, unmasks the silence of the international community regarding Palestinians. Referencing the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who expressed the pain of being abandoned by the Arab countries and called for unmasking their ignorance after the siege of Beirut in 1982, Raheb calls for the unmasking of the international community's silence toward the cries of the Palestinians towards the genocide in Gaza. He claims, quote, Gaza in 2023-2024 has exposed the mask of the international community. Their masks have fallen. We were aware that the world was not in a rosy state, but Gaza showed us the real faces without makeup. Gaza became a magnifying glass that revealed the details of the ugly face that were not obvious previously. We can now see things as they are and understand the state of the world more clearly. End of quote. The world after Nicaea is a world in which the mask of terror, ignorance, and violence must fall. If Gaza is a lens through which we envision the call to be judged today, then it is a call to be against the world of masks. From Gaza, we witness that the one who breaks bread is the raptured one. In Gaza, there is no bread to break, only his body that has been being raptured every day in the land of the raptured world. The unexpected guest who turned out to be the host unveiled the mask of fear and terror that had overwhelmed the two disciples by performing the most familiar ritual of breaking bread. But the unmasking is a kind of decolonial practice which requires a metanoia, a transformation of all the presumably correct and normative knowledge of who the guest who turned out to be the host was. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Luke 24, verse 31. The Lord unveils the fear and terror that had covered the disciples' eyes so they can see, but as their knowledge of the previously unknown descends, the Lord is already gone. The breaking of bread becomes both the site and the posture of the rapture. Breaking bread is the afterlife site where the dead and the living are interwoven. When the resurrected Lord broke the bread, that is the afterlife posture, the sign of his raptured body. Second, a child with the staples of fish and bread from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. For me, it is a spirituality of enough. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people? John 6, verse 9. The child with the staple foods of fish and bread reflects a dimension of the vulnerability of the raptured posture in the story of 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread in John chapter 6, 1 through 15. Different from the version of the story in the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John inserts a fascinating piece of information. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people? In John, the child becomes an important figure in sustaining the life of the ochlos, the ordinary people. Although there is only one sentence about the child, rereading the story from his perspective shifts the orientation and character of the story. Here, the economy, the household management and distribution is now dependent on the most vulnerable section of the populace, the community of thousands of hungry people. While the disciples doubt the feasibility of the only obvious option that is available, but what are they among so many people? Jesus exercises an alternative management of the household. He orders, make the people sit down from verse 10. Sitting down is a calming exercise. Sitting down in groups, moreover, is a collective exercise of sharing the energy of trust. We can imagine that if thousands of hungry people gathered, they would become vulnerable to external influences. Violence might be imminent. Jesus seems to know this, so instead of ordering the food to be distributed immediately, he creates a safe space for everyone to receive and to share the seemingly insufficient sources for their meal. Furthermore, if we reread this story intertextually with texts of Mark 6, verse 40 and Luke 9, verse 14, we will see the extent to which grouping becomes an effective strategy. The crowd is divided into groups of 50 or 100, and this grouping is also intended to create groups that share their resources. Often we assume that the crowd, the ordinary, the poor, has nothing to share. But perhaps in this story the gospel writers are inviting us to imagine otherwise. Perhaps the people in the crowd have little. They may, like the disciples, think that what they have is not enough for themselves, let alone for others. But the story of the child with the fish and bread tells us otherwise. Some people may still have some food, but indeed it is not sufficient. Some people may only have small snacks left that will not be enough for a big meal. The miracle that Jesus performed remains veiled in the story. It is only told that the staples, the broken loaves of bread and the fish, are distributed. The groups shared among themselves, and everyone was able to eat and to have more than they would have had. Often we pay attention only to the distribution of resources. We forget the human experience, the trust, the sharing, and the capacity to save, to sustain, that creates resources enough for everyone. This is why the child with the staple foods become an important biblical metaphor for a theology of enough. The child represents the most vulnerable section of the community that holds the resources of the household. Acknowledging the presence and the gift of the child, Jesus gestures toward a different principle in managing the household, the principle of enough. This is a risky principle in the context of a global landscape of capitalism, capitalism, and an economy that is oriented towards good and production and not towards the sustainability of the whole creation. The story in John is also a reverse model of an economy that may be regarded as irrelevant in the context of the global economy of fear and hatred. The child with the staple food is a metaphor for an economy of life, a praxis that is embedded in the ethics of life and sharing instead of fear, hatred, and the voracious desire to have it all for oneself or for the group of the world's richest to one person. In Matthew 14, verse 16, Jesus said to the disciples, "You give them something to eat." This ministry, managing, sharing, the reciprocity of giving and receiving, sustaining and being accountable to the future and the life of the community is imperative in the economy of life. Instead of absorbing all the resources for themselves, the disciples are trained to trust the ability of the crowd to receive and to give. But the child in the story is not from Gaza, nor from any of the many places of hunger and famine in today's world. We're reading the story of this child in light of the ruptured bodies of children in Gaza, women and elderly, and men and the sick, and other places of hunger and desperation, unmasked the failure of our ecumenical fellowship if we refuse to unmask the power that is violating the most basic right of human, the right to have enough nutritious food and clean water. Third, dancing on the water. Matthew 14:22 through 33, a messy theology. It said, "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid.'" Have you ever imagined that the Lord not only walked, but also danced on the water? The last part of my presentation is about reimagining an ecumenical site from the context of the climate emergency, particularly the oceanic crisis of maritime countries like Indonesia, the Pacifics, and many others. Country, Indonesia, is more than 17,000 islands. As I wrote recently, the story is surrounded by water, by the stormy sea. If Jesus walked on the water and Peter sank into the water in today's world, what kind of water would we imagine as the setting? We are all familiar with the disciples' reaction to the walking on the water Lord. We know about the fear and how Peter overcame his fear to approach the Lord, who reached out to him saying, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." But often we forgot to imagine what kind of water, seas, rivers, or lakes that the Lord would walk on today amid the oceanic crisis. The archipelago of Raja Ampat in West Papua, for example, it is the easternmost area of Indonesia, known for its rich and beautiful biodiversity. Nickel mining in Raja Ampat has damaged the coral reefs, reduced biodiversity, led to deforestation, and impacted the broader ecosystem of the surrounding community. Similar cases of mining and the exploitation of the ocean, such as in East Halmahera of North Maluku, Indonesia, also reflect the conflict between economic investment, political regulations, and the sustainability of the environment. Rereading the story of the Lord walking on the water from the experiences of Raja Ampat's community is a testimony to the destructive and corrupt political and economic powers that exploit nature and ignore the urgent need to be ethical as one of the simplest ways of sustaining the life and the future of the environment, of the ecological community in the world, in places like in West Papua and rest of the world. Imagining the Lord dancing on the sea, on the waters of Raja Ampat, on the waters that are familiar to all of us, is a challenge and an invitation to the ecumenical fellowship to dance, to weave together change, resistance, and resilience, and to reclaim the voice of the Lord. Take courage. It is I, don't be afraid, amid the risks of advocating for sustainability and the flourishing of eco-human communities. Faith and Order Commission in the document Cultivate and Care reminds us that if the churches are to be in pilgrimage together, it can only be in the context of journeying toward the unity of the church within creation. End of quote. Dancing on the water is a different kind of rupture posture, a compassionate posture. As I have stated elsewhere, it is the posture of compassionate dancer who has messy yet beautiful movements, who follows Jesus in the midst of a marine ecological crisis that resists the power that discriminates against, violates, and harms the sea. The sea is a ruptured size since it is the landscape where the marginalized refuse to be silent, dancing the dance of the sea to challenge the powers that be in the struggle for transformation, justice, and healing. Dancing on the water mirrors a different kind of ruptured posture. End of quote. Dancing on the water needs to become dancing with the water to create a massive narrative where hope becomes a risky practice amid ecological distractions. These three analogies, the breaking of bread, a child with fish and loaves of bread, and the dancing on the water, project a kind of ecumenical posture, an ecumenical presence today as a ruptured posture, as a ruptured presence. It is a witnessing posture that says not what we churches are, but what we are not, amid the kind of interlocking yet contesting global powers that take all of us in the direction of despair, not hope, of destruction, of not life, of darkness that denies the presence of lights. The via negativa is the path of our ecumenical journey now, as it is in the lands of brokenness everywhere in our world today. Finally, as this panel is addressing how to be church today, the Benedictine nun John Chittister, a great spiritual figure of our time, responds to the questions of how to be human today, providing insight into a practice relevant to being ecumenical today. She says that to be human today is to listen to the world with a tender heart. This means seeing with compassionate eyes so that we may see the ruptured faces, voices, and bodies of all the victims and survivors, touching with a passionate and healing touch so that we may feel the ruptured body of the resurrected Lord in the bodies of the broken and the violated. For 1700 years, the church has seen humanity fail, be glorified, be broken, and be gone. For centuries, the church has heard and now is being called to listen with a tender yet broken heart, which is the afterlife posture and voice of Jesus, who said, "Do this in remembrance of me."
Yeah, do this in remembrance of raptured me. A world that celebrates ignorance and hatred is not the world that we desire. Thank you so much, the Reverend Dr. Lakawa, for that powerful first keynote speech. And allow me to remind you to keep sending your questions via the QR code, and the questions will be responded to us after all the three speakers have spoken. Now let me introduce to us our second keynote speaker, who is the very Reverend Dr. Evangelos Thiani. Dr. Evangelos Thiani is a doctor of theology and senior lecturer at the Orthodox Patriarchate Ecclesiastical School at Bishop Makarios III of Cyprus Seminary in Nairobi, Kenya. His doctoral dissertation at the University of the Eastern Finland in Junsu on transformative philanthropic diaconia of the African Orthodox Church of Kenya was published at the University Press of the University of Eastern Finland in 2024. Additionally, Father Evangelos has published a number of articles of African Orthodoxy and its diaconia. Father Evangelos, you're welcome, please.
Good morning. Allow me, first of all, to thank the Faith and Order Commission for this opportunity and also to bring regards from our Pope and Patriarch Theophilus II, as well as our Father in Christ, Metropolitan Seraphim, who was not able to be with us in this conference due to unavoidable circumstances. My talk is on Christian political ecclesiology of our time versus mission. The first slide, please. Nicaea was a highly politically motivated gathering, and Constantine, the relationship between church and state took a new direction. The state's influence on religious affairs and theology, along with the church's use of the state in its missionary efforts and expansion, began to evolve. This fostered a form of political religiosity that still influences the political ecclesiology of Christians today. While some churches have rejected the excessive closeness of the state and the church, others believe it is essential. Later Byzantine rulers and Greco-Roman church adopted this Nicene model, developing it into a symphonia, a balance of church-state relations, if you will, until the fall of Byzantium in AD 1453. During this era, the church observed that when an empire is too closely aligned with the church, then the failures of the empire are also seen as the church's failures. Additionally, those who despise or seek to overthrow the empire often target the church as well. Despite these lessons, modern Christianity still shows a nostalgic desire to work closely with the state. This tendency is seen beyond 19th century Eastern national churches and post-Soviet Union ideologies. In contrast, the political involvement of Western churches is visible in the global South and American Trump-related politics. This presentation aims to understand how the churches manage and are influenced by the church-state relations beyond Nicaea, how this influences their ecclesiology and mission today. The case of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria and all Africa, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and the Kenyan churches ecumenically shows contemporary church struggles of mission, ethnicities, nationalism, and politics. The call for reviewing and establishing modern political ecclesiology is proposed. Next slide, please. I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. John 17, 16, and 17. Church-state relations have experienced varying levels of support and rejection, both within and outside the church in modern times. Is the church in and for the world? A question. Is the church in but not for the world? Another. Some critics believe the church should focus solely on the gospel and avoid involvement with secular institutions like the state and its dirty politics. For such critics, the church is a holy institution that should avoid worldly matters. This separation helps the church preserve its prophetic voice against the state, prevent complacency among religious leaders amid state failures and corruption, avoids theological conflicts that could influence politics of spark national disputes, safeguards religious pluralism and freedom, prevent persecution of minority faiths, and even maintain state neutrality. Those who favor limited church-state relations recognize, as Augustine did, that while cooperation is necessary, the church and state are two distinct institutions. One is an earthly city, and the other is a city of God, each with its own authority, secular and spiritual, and led by the citizen choices. The earthly city deals with worldly and temporal matters, whereas the city of God concentrates on spiritual lives with a heavenly destiny. In this worldview, although the state operates in the world, it must do so under God's law. Therefore, in this relationship, the church works with the state, holding a higher position than the state. On the other hand, if the state is led by moral decay and vices, it falls. But if it wants to stand, it must keep the church's purity. The third approach involves aligning church and state relations so that they function as one in promoting religious and political issues, what the Orthodox call symphonia. These joint efforts and resources to expand their influence, promote policies and laws based on spiritual and moral values, encourage civic participation, and strengthen community bonds. Here, the church continuously prays for the state and works alongside it in its endeavors sanctifying the state's activity. Meanwhile, the state supports the church in reaching new heights in its mission and philanthropic diaconia works. While it sounds ideal, achieving such a balance is never easy. The development of the Constantinian church-state relations in Byzantium continued excessively. Justinian I, a 6th century Byzantine emperor and theologian, elevated this relationship by creating political laws that directly concern the church and declaring that church councils have equal status with imperial law. As a result, rejecting church councils and imperial laws relating to the church was officially considered lawlessness, punishable by the state. The state sanctioned normal canons, in other words, political religious laws, would sometimes elevate the church's ideals and agendas and sometimes be used as a way for the empire to control the church. The state was viewed as the body and the church as the soul of the empire. This close relationship between imperial normi, secular laws, and church canones, canon law, led to the creation of the Eastern Church's 6th to 15th century canon law collection called the normal canons, blending imperial and church canon law. While this symphony worked well for the church, it infringed on those who were against the existing church theology and Christianity. Next slide. Constantine and Nicaea. The Eastern Church considered Constantine the Great a saint equal to the apostles. The Church honors him not only for ending early Christian persecutions and martyrdoms, for legally enabling the Church and its evangelizational efforts to operate freely, but also for helping expand the Church's mission and growth in the newly unified Greco-Roman Empire and into regions where the faith was previously unknown as the empire expanded. As emperor, Constantine may have primarily aimed to grow and maintain peace in his empire, not necessarily to promote the church's growth or spread the gospel across the Pax Romana. However, his actions had a lasting influence on the church's expansion and mission during his time and beyond. The Constantinian policies of the 4th century became an effective model for mission that later Christian empires would follow. As the Byzantine Empire expanded from the Nicene period onward, so did the Christian faith. Whether the empire's expansion was voluntary, when communities requested to join, or forceful, when the empire fought to take over other territories, the church expanded in those regions either way. To others, Constantine the Great and his successors were tyrants who used the church to force their ideologies, expanding their empire far and wide with faith as a weapon. The state would sometimes imprison, exile, banish, or even execute those deemed heretics. While this use of force by the state against heretics often resulted in their submission to the Orthodox faith, it sometimes backfired. When it did, especially when the state's action against the heretics was seen as martyrdom, the heretical side of the church would grow even more in some areas than the Orthodox side, again affecting mission in those regions. The state has therefore conducted both positively and negatively to the church's mission from the very beginning. The Byzantine Empire grew the relationship between the church and state even further, funding church activities, including paying the clergy, building churches and monasteries, funding the church's social welfare, and even allowing the church to perform the legal union of loved ones in marriage. The church in this period is considered not just a fundamental ally of the state, but fundamentally a substantial part of the empire. State-church relations expanded to the extent that the fate of one affected the other significantly. The first and second iconoclastic controversies of the Byzantine period find the church and state in this situation. The debate in the 7th to 9th century about whether religious images, icons, would be accepted among the Christians of the Byzantine Empire was fundamental to both the state and the church. Representing the saints and the gospel message in iconography was central to the church's faith. Meanwhile, for the state, if worship were done wrongly, then the wrath of God would surely bring down the empire. This brought the involvement of the emperors and empresses in time sophisticated philosophical and theological arguments on the use of icons. The Nicene debates of Christ's humanity and divinity resurfaced, becoming the primary reason for the icon lovers, iconodules, winning over the icon haters, the iconoclasts. The first and second periods of iconoclasm in the Byzantine period saw the state and church crash over icons because they were seen as forms of idolatry, conflicting with Christology and the first commandment. This conflict was also linked to the Byzantines' loss to wars to the Ottoman Empire, which resulted in the loss of significant territories to Arabs and Persians. It was believed that God was displeased with the icons in Byzantium. Therefore, this disapproval was seen as the reason for the hardship of faith by the church and the empire. Emperors ordered the removal of Christ's icon from imperial coins, the destruction of icons, and the persecution of iconodules. These periods of persecution and iconoclasm ended with Empress Irene during the first period and Empress Theodora during the second. The incarnation of Christ, the God-man, along with distinctions between honor and worship as well as between image and prototype, were key theological arguments that ultimately led to the restoration of icons in the church. This victory marked the triumph of orthodoxy, which is celebrated today on the first Sunday of Lent in the Eastern Orthodox churches. Because the church's faith was believed to influence the nation's faith, the tension between politics and political ecclesiology, along with iconoclasm, significantly impacted the mission and unity of the church in the 8th and 9th centuries. The church's conflict and divisions would not have stopped without the two queens we see here. Next slide, please. Political ecclesiology and mission. When political ecclesiology favors a close relationship between the state and the church, each institution benefits from the other. For the state, this helped calm the populace and decrease uprising of the opposition. Anyone opposing the state was also against the church. Many citizens, being Christian, avoided opposing their church-sanctioned Christian governments. Additionally, the church assisted the state in reaching grassroots communities through its state-funded philanthropic diaconia efforts. As a result, the state used the church as a form of soft power, enabling it to rule without significant opposition. For the church, this political ecclesiology fostered greater church unity through state-sanctioned shared theologies that helped eradicate heresies. The church grew under the protection of the state, which safeguarded its people and church institutions. Furthermore, the church's mission expanded into new imperial territories. The church's mission was further extended through state-funded social work, which helped shape and uplift many lives. Church-state relations also posed threats to the church's growth and mission and could harm those who did not follow the official church theology and administration as promoted by the state-recognized church. Additionally, the church was sometimes complicit in supporting the right and just political leadership, but at times it also endorsed wrong and unjust religious policies of the empire. The church's occasional silent acceptance of unjust situation weakened its prophetic voice and mission, which conflicted with the gospel it preached, leading to the loss and suffering of some Christians and regions. From Nicaea to today, Christians continue to pray and to work to maintain close state and church ties that help the church influence society, but it remains an enigma. Next slide, please. The role of political theology within the church, that is political ecclesiology, is essential for understanding how the church influences and is influenced by society in promoting justice, peace, equality, national leadership, and socio-economic stability.
The word politics, merged with theology, sounds more worldly than divine. Is the church in or for the world? The question again. Some see the world as evil, while others believe the God-created world is meant for sanctification. For the Orthodox, the church's mission and its worship exist for the better life of the world. As the church in its mission seeks to recover and catch up with the life that has gone astray, as says Father Alexander Schmemann. Here the church cannot escape the world, nor can the world escape the church. The world needs sanctification and priest of creation from the church, and the world provides the church with sacramental elements used to sanctify the world, and everything that has breath used to glorify God. Christ's incarnation and the salvation he grants are part of the journey, the world and all creation, getting sanctified through the church, creating a vision of the reign of God on earth. Therefore, as Platon argues, Orthodox Christianity is marked by the vision of the eternal kingdom of heaven and the beauty of God's transcendence. Yet Orthodox Christianity, contrary to assumption, does not free the world or condemn it as essentially evil. Rather, intensely aware of God's creation of all things as good and of the entrance of God into creation by the incarnation of Christ, one should embrace the world as the only place where the drama of salvation occurs. The church, as the outreach of the kingdom, seeks to transform the world again into God's good creation, end of quote. Deducing all this puts the church in a difficult position. The church is focused on the eschaton, the life of the age to come, but it also exists in the world where it is called to make disciples for Christ, as the Great Commission in Matthew 28:16-20 tells us. To use creation to glorify God, as Genesis insists. The church must fulfill both roles, even when tensions arise between the world and itself. Next slide, please. Contemporary churches have favored one or the other political modalities. Assessing them is paramount in understanding how this affects the mission. Here are some examples of the complexity of church-state relations in contemporary Orthodox mission, especially here in Africa. Case study 1 is the Church of Russia, Ukraine, here in Africa. The Eastern Orthodox Church spread to Slavic lands through invitation from their rulers, including King Rostrav and Prince Vladimir. Furthermore, the Byzantine Symphonia molded in this region was used to unify the people and resist Germanic influences and their Latin missionary efforts. Therefore, the use of church-state relations to delay religious and political competition in these lands is not new, as many may think. After communism, the church in Russia experienced a significant revival. It re-entered society and impacted the country's social identity, religious life, and political policies. The government supported rebuilding churches and monasteries, along with the church's extensive philanthropic work, while the church built the people's spiritual identity. Meanwhile, the church and state supported the ideologies of the Russian world. This Ruski Mir, Russian world ideology, which envisions the state and church in Russia growing and influencing others globally, was revived, especially under President Putin and Patriarch Kirill. They particularly emphasized the importance of avoiding westernized ideologies, Western politics, and even Western religiosities. This policy favors the Russian Orthodox Church and the state, along with their global expansionist goals. The ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war is, according to the Russians, about distancing the Slavic territory from Western influence, including Western religiosity, Western economics, Western politics, and even Western modernity. NATO and the Ecumenical Patriarch are seen as oppressors by the Russian state and church narrative. For the Ukrainians, a state and even a church can choose who to associate with. Therefore, their desire to be free of the Russian models, whether that favors what has traditionally been accepted or been their stand. The Ukrainian church and state jointly sought liberation from Russia. The state knew it would not go far without the church, and vice versa. Therefore, President Zelensky, a Jewish man, was also involved in pushing for the autocephaly of the Ukrainian church. He equally needed the church's support in distancing his nation from Russia. To stop this joint church-state move of the Ukrainians, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and to this day, the deaths registered from both countries are staggering. Indeed, of the two nations having come from the same church, being the reason they unite and finding ways of bringing a ceasefire, That was not the case. Being Orthodox, among others, have instead fueled the war between the two countries rather than unite them. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria and all Africa supported the Ukrainian state and church on this issue. The Patriarchate of Alexandria accepted the autocephaly granted by the Ecumenical Patriarch in 2018 to Ukraine, but also condemned the war afterward. This decision significantly affected the Church of Alexandria. The Moscow Patriarchate proclaimed the Patriarchate of Alexandria as schismatic church and eventually established an exarchate in Africa in 2021, considering there is no more an Eastern Orthodox church in Africa, taking some of the Patriarchate of Alexandria's clergy and churches in the region. This has led to many court cases, conflicts, and losses of Orthodox Christians amidst many parish conflicts which were not there before. Additionally, the canonical territory of the Patriarchate of Alexandria, confirmed by Canon 6 of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, and later expanded with a sub-Saharan section added by the Ecumenical Patriarch to Alexandria in 1921, was for the first time encroached upon by a canonical Eastern Church. Furthermore, many Africans have since joined the war in Ukraine through job agencies, as Russia uses the church as a tool of soft power to expand its economic and military influence in Africa. All these factors have caused the long-standing relationship between the Patriarchate of Alexandria and the Moscow Patriarchate to break, with both churches no longer in communion. The distant conflict in Ukraine has profoundly impacted the African Orthodox mission. Next slide, please. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church, the largest Oriental Orthodox church in the world by membership, became autonomous from the Coptic Orthodox Church in 1959. Since then, it has faced daily leadership struggles that threatened its unity. Unfortunately, recent national events have plunged the church into highly politicized and ethnic conflicts. In 1991, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church split into two factions, forcing the one of their patriarchs, Abuna Makarios, and his followers into exile for over 27 years. The schism and exile occurred after a new patriarch was elected, following the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, removing the Darg military regime from power. It was again a Darg military officer turned politician and Ethiopian Prime Minister in April 2018, under the Prosperity Party, who helped bring this Ethiopian Orthodox group back from exile to Ethiopia. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, an adherent of Oromian Pentecostalism, brokered the reunion of the two patriarchs and sought peace within Ethiopia. This effort, along with others, ultimately led to Prime Minister Abiy receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. The state promoted the unity of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, demonstrating how much it valued the church's cohesion and how much respect the Ethiopian church still holds for the Ethiopian nation, if at all they agreed to broker their union. Then came the ongoing war in northern Ethiopia, which started in 2020, between the Ethiopian National Defense Force and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Many lives have been lost, properties destroyed, and military and political leaders arrested and persecuted. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church remained silent at first, probably because Prime Minister Abiy, who united the Ethiopian church, also led the defense forces that were fighting the Tigrayans, limiting their prophetic voice. Some Ethiopian Orthodox clergy and lay people from the north, realizing that their church headquarters was not defending them, took action to fill the gap. They were seen as out of line because that was not supposed to be their role. This sparked the current divide between the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo clergy and faithful, between the north and the south. Upon closer examination, what fractured the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church was not a crescendo or theological issues, since none have been raised, but rather national differences intertwined with the local ethnic identities. The Orthodox Christians in northern Ethiopia are mostly of the Tigrayan ethnicity, while those in the central and southern regions are mainly of Amharan and Oromo ethnicities. Ethiopia's national differences are similarly shaped by such divisions line. Therefore, ethnicity combined with national politics seem to influence the Ethiopian church and state to the point of breaking them apart. Next slide. The Kenyan Gen Z movement and the church. The churches of Kenya have been involved in political matters since colonial times. The churches that supported the Mau Mau liberation movement from 1930 until 1963, when Kenya gained independence, included the current independent and Orthodox churches in Kenya, as the missionary churches at the time backed colonial authorities. The second significant phase of social liberation in Kenya occurred during the push for multi-party democracy in the 1990s. During this period, churches like the Anglicans, Presbyterians, and the Roman Catholics were actively engaged in political issues of the day. These prophetic roles and action helped build public trust in Kenyan churches, especially on social and political matters. Then came the year 2022. National political campaigns, during which Kenyan churches were heavily involved in accepting money from politicians and allowing them to use the pulpit for campaign purposes. The Kenyan churches are constantly accused of excusing the wrongdoings of politicians who generally donate to their cause. While a few churches have opposed those actions vehemently, most politicians visit the churches that support them. These actions are televised to normalize them within the nation, making it seem like all churches are involved. While this continues, rising unemployment, corruption, impunity, and increasing living costs persist. This emanates from poor governance and the deteriorating social ethics in the youthful nation of Kenya. The church's prophetic voice was weaker compared to the 1990s and was barely heard at this time. This situation angered and motivated the Kenyan Gen Z movement in 2024, when young Kenyans took to the streets to oppose the Financial Bill 2024 and the current president and his government agendas. A number lost their lives. But the Gen Z remained relentless until they got what they wanted, to be heard and have their voices translated into action. The Gen Zs of Kenya claimed that the church had betrayed them and that after reforming the nation, they vowed to also come and cleanse the church. Due to misguided political ecclesiology, the most trusted institution in Kenya quickly lost public trust. In conclusion, the last slide. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? Galatians 3, 1-3. If told to the church today, these words of St. Paul to the Galatians would sound very offensive, as I'm sure some of you are already now. But when one looks at how the church handles the politics of the day and how that affects the mission of the church and through it the mission of God, one is left to wonder, are we truly not bewitched? Contemporary Christian political ecclesiologies are highly nationalistic and ethnic to the point that they overshadow the church's mission in the world. This suppresses, frustrates, and that restricts evangelization, missionary growth, and the church's social efforts. When a church becomes too involved in state affairs without proper limits, it sometimes loses its saltiness and prophetic voice to the extent that it might bless and support war, bless and support conflict, bless and support church divisions instead of seeking for visible unity. A church today that clearly understands that, supports the state, is dividing the church of Christ, but still continues down that path, would they not be bewitched? The church must learn to detach itself from empires because they come and go. The church exists in and for the world and must stay true to the mission of the sanctifying grace of the world. This is achieved not just through prayer, but also prophetically guiding the world through the liturgy, after the liturgy, the mission. Metanoia is needed. Reevaluation of the church and state relations are necessary to achieve a renewal of deserving of the followers of Christ and the church which seeks visible unity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. When the empire is closely related to the church, then the church is also seen as an empire. Is the church in and not for the world? And as the Kenya Gen Z say, the silence of the church is too loud. I am one of them. So allow me to invite our last keynote speaker, who is the Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner. Dr. Carlton Turner is a contextual and practical Dr. Carlton Turner is a tutor in contextual and practical theology and Deputy Director of Research at Queen's Foundation and also Canon Theologian at Liverpool Cathedral. He leads the Anti-Racism in Theological Education research project carried out at the Queen's Foundation through sponsorship of the Racial Justice Unit of the Church of England. He is author of two academic monographs, Overcoming Self-Negation, Jankuno and the Church in Contemporary Bahamian Society, and Caribbean Contextual Theology, an Introduction. He's also published many book chapters and articles which are in the intersections of practical theology, racism, decolonization, and particularly theologies formed within the African Caribbean. Furthermore, Carlton is also a fellow of the John Templeton Cross-Training in Psychology for Theologians through the University of Birmingham, where his research focuses on racism in the Church of England. Dr. Carlton, you're welcome, please.
To your holinesses, eminences, excellencies, the wider WCC family, it's a privilege to be here. I greet you from the Caribbean, and I stand with my brothers and sisters here to offer our reflections on mission as we respond to the theme, Where Now for Visible Unity, and I Do Not Stand Alone. We are in Egypt, and remember this land as the place of refuge for the Holy Family. This is not just a holy place, but this is a time of persecution, infanticide, imperial rule, colonial rule, and utter violence. For us in the Caribbean, Egypt is also the site of another key biblical moment. It is the place of forced labor, exploitation, imperial domination, one in which we learn the name and the power of God to deliver. It is where we hear the words, "Let my people go." In these lands, we learn the divine name, I am that I am. I will be what I will be. I cause to be what I cause to be. It is the land of the Exodus, and we sing it. We hear it in the haunting words of Bob Marley, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Won't you help me sing these songs of freedom? They're all I've ever had. Redemption songs." Theologians in the liberation tradition see that God in these lands show us that there is a preferential option for the poor. And in the place of the Caribbean, as Cartwright Davis reminds us, that emancipation is still coming. It's by no accident that we're here. Egypt is the place where we learn firstly about the processes of empire and colonization, and of a God who stands in the midst of it all and declares his holy name and his holy nature. These are also the lands that have taught us to find God in the desert. In the earliest memories of the church, you have taught us to guard the divine mystery. the incredible sight of the mystics and of the desert fathers and mothers, the ones who remind us that God is a living God, not far removed or remote, but here and now in the midst of a very broken world. And it is here that I want to unpack for us this idea of decolonization and the need to always make an inward journey to resist the destructive, mammonic, alienating, numbing, dehumanizing, insidious, idolatrous legacies of colonial power. I offer a Caribbean perspective, for we have come to see that even the church and even the faith is not immune from the destructive powers of colonization. That we must delink, disentangle, and decolonize from our multiple perpetrations of violence. But before I go to my context, let's begin with Jesus the Christ. John 18:36-38, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" Firstly, we cannot escape the drama of violence within this text. This isn't just a story. This is a detailed description of public state execution. Jesus is a first-century Palestinian Jew under Roman colonial rule, and the stakes are high. He offers something other than the brutal violence of colonial rule. He embodies a different way that Pilate cannot understand. Secondly, the question no longer is about Jesus, his nature, his person, but the drama reflects on and exposes the kind of kingdom that sought to displace Jesus' kingdom of peace. In John's narrative imagination, Jesus exposes both the futility and the preposterous attempts at power and control, the heartbeat of colonial rule. And finally, as the writer of John's Gospel leaves that big question hanging, what is truth? When we read the Gospel, truth has always been a person, Jesus, God incarnate, the hope of salvation. We must wrestle with the biblical text as also the place in which colonial forces play out. Jesus cannot be understood apart from Roman colonial rule. Colonization does not begin with the expansion into the New World in 1492. Colonization is fundamentally the context of the biblical world. It is the context in which prophets proclaim God's justice. It is the context in which the Nicene Creed develops. It is the context in which we live here and now, without question. It is always in the room, in every religion, in every denomination, and in every church. Wherever power is used to exploit, to alienate, to silence, to intimidate, to ignore, to ridicule, and to, as my Palestinian friend Reverend Ashrif reminds us, to dehumanize. Same power, same process, same motivation, same kingdom, and it is not the kingdom of God. The common faith in the revelation of the triune God as agreed in Nicaea remains an enduring, beautiful, and good summation of the faith that we should rejoice in. However, the truth of God's revelation is not that which needs to be defended here, unlike the ancient controversies over Arianism. What needs assessment and exploration are the kinds of Christianity that we have always sought to defend who have always sought to defend the truth of Nicaea. And thinking from the global south, particularly the African Caribbean, where the mission of the church proceeded through colonial violence, a decolonial approach to our common Christian inheritance requires deep inward work. Perhaps we might learn from those who have had to navigate the shadow side of the church in Christian history. And I find no better example than the region where Christopher Columbus first made landfall, on a small island in the Bahamas, where I'm from, by the way. I just want to plug that. The island was called Guanahani. He named it San Salvador. And when you get to name something, you pretend to be God over it. Decolonization must be an uncomfortable term for us. And it might be confusing for you, since when we hear these terms, all sorts of things might come into our minds. And in the politics of our times, it is not a word or a movement that can be easily adapted in our current political environment. Colonization, let's begin there, can be considered, as Marcella Althus Reed states, a method of physical, symbolic control characterized by the act of settling a community into a region or country of a different cultural, religious, and political ethos. In the history of Christianity, as well as the history and geographical landscape of the biblical world, colonial processes have always been at play. Violence has been germane in this process as the active control and dominion of cultures by an incoming power, which by means of superior military and political force can effectively exercise substantial power over others. Thinkers across the world have been highlighting the fact that this thing is complex and deep, and it pervades everything that we are. We think of Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Sylvia Wynter, Amy Cesar, three of whom are Caribbean, by the way. They have highlighted this inherently complex and often interdependent violence between oppressed and oppressor. And I tend to look at decolonization through reflecting on what is fundamentally a big part of it, and that is violence. And I want to unpack that quickly for you. Violence is anthropological in how human beings are framed theologically, more often conforming to European biases. Non-Western and global South persons and their theologies, amongst many other academic disciplines, have noted the ways in which human beings have been framed along racial and ethnic categories that justified and served the purposes of European expansion into the non-Western world. For example, Noel Erskine's formative work on decolonizing theology within a Caribbean context begins with an examination of the framing of the indigenous other beyond the pale of civilization, immediately designating them as subhuman. Similar reflections have flooded the theological landscape from other parts of the global South: Asia, Africa, Oceania, Pacifica, Latin America, North American indigenous persons, amongst others. This list is not exhaustive. If you are othered and you are considered non-human, a beast of burden, the epitome of sinfulness, then you can do whatever you want to me without conscience. This violence is also epistemological in how knowledge systems are used to disparage and to ignore. Walter Magnolo's exploration of Western modernity and its epistemological implications is particularly important here. He calls for epistemic disobedience. This thing is so deep. You need to think about how you think. This violence is also cultural. Ways of life by cultures pre-existing Europe by millennia are often minimized and supplanted. Missionary Christianity in its many guises proceeded by cultural suppression and its own ethnic and cultural exceptionalism. Contextual theologies of the global south consistently challenge either the cultural appropriation of the biblical world into contemporary empires through suppressionist thought, or Euro-American exceptionalism, or the total disregard for non-Western expressions of theology. This is not an exhaustive list, but we demonize Obeah in my context, and voodoo, and Mayal, and Rastafari. Please look these things up. The spiritual Baptists. But we fail to see that the most demonic and destructive force was the version of the church in plantation societies. This violence is also ecological. Coloniality is not simply an anthropocentric endeavor that has implications solely for human beings and their political interactions. It has implications for the land, the air, the sea, and all the creatures of God's beauteous creation. And thinkers such as Malcolm Ferdinand remind us that the events such as transatlantic slave trade did not simply affect human bodies. They significantly reshaped the land and the animals. This violence is also existential. By this I mean that literal bodily violence is still perpetrated in the name of God, especially the God of the Bible. Perhaps the most glaring outworking of the colonial agenda is the persistent physical violence towards the marginalized and the colonized. And from the Caribbean context, the relationship between the extraction of capital, the civilizing and evangelizing of the indigenous, and the expansion of Christendom, like European nations, into new territories, led to the decimation of the original inhabitants of the New World, and subsequently the enslavement and genocide of my people. When we trace war and violence across the globe, we undoubtedly encounter some form of coloniality. It can be religious, political, ideological, economic, or a combination of all the above, but it is there. It is also theological. And ultimately, a decolonial turn suggests that theology itself, as it has been formulated, inherited, perpetrated, and exercised, is often colonized or colonizing. We must check our theology. I could go on, because there are more ways to define this. In preparing for Nicaea 2025, big questions come to the forefront about doctrine or about the current importance or use of the Nicene Creed in contemporary conversations around unity. Susan Derber, who we heard from, reminds us of the multiple legacies of the creeds that still must be deeply considered. To even speak of a creed and how it functions and who it includes or who it excludes necessitates a conversation around colonization and decolonization. Creeds are about faith. But hear me, creeds are also about power. The faith that has been handed down to the beloved region, that I come from is not, nor has ever been innocent, nor neutral. It has been violent. And where uninterrogated and unconfronted, this violence is handed down generation after generation in one form or the other. A brief historical survey must begin with Christopher Columbus, where the New World was encountered for the first time. And if you meet people you never saw before, and they happen to be a little bit brown, unlike you, and you are about to be shipwrecked, what's your first reaction? This is what he writes in his journal. It appears to me that the people are ingenious and would be good servants. Where does that come from? And I am of the opinion that they would readily become Christians. Why? As they appear to have no religion. Really? They very quickly learn words that are spoken to them. And if it please our Lord, I intend at my return to carry home 6 of them to your holinesses. What? This was the first meeting of Europe in the New World, amid a time when fiery embers of the Reformation were beginning to come alive in Western Christianity. The region that was to become the Caribbean was the first meeting point between what I refer to as missionary Christianity or European imperialist Christianity and the various indigenous cultures that populated the lands and seas of the New World. But we know the story. He enters, and genocide follows. I often make the distinction that what came into the region beginning with Columbus was not the church, but a version of it. One that hid deeply violent tendencies as much as it carried the Christian revelation revealed in Nicaea. What entered the region was a form of Christianity built upon the creedal formulations of Nicaea, but one that was also deeply imperial and as such deeply violent to those deemed marginal to the European imagination. All the denominations of Christianity are represented in my region. They're there. Every religion, or most of them, are there. All sit within colonial violence. The very shaping of the region was violent. Let me conclude. For me, decolonization is meant to be an inner process of awareness of the complex legacies of colonization in shaping the present world in which we live. As a matter of fact, we have a world marked by violence, religions generally, and the church in particular, no matter their historical roots, bear much responsibility for this violence. To be clear, the church, no matter the denomination, has done good work. I'm not dismissing that. However, we are neither innocent nor neutral and must be subjected to decolonial scrutiny for our own sake. I liken this process to that of a kind of therapy, an introspection. While we function in the world, it does not mean that we are not in need of healing ourselves, wholeness ourselves, so that we might be agents of healing and wholeness in return, and not perpetrators of violence in its many forms. And believe me, violence isn't about all what you do. Violence is also the silence that you hold. As you remove yourself from the real trauma of the world. Decolonization is a means of bringing about hidden and unconscious, often not so hidden and unconscious, colonial traumas and tendencies to the conscious mind so that they might be addressed. I have explored the relationship between coloniality and violence using the African Caribbean as an example. The region and the formation of the church within it, was shaped by imperialist European expansion. We must bear in mind that the ancient creedal affirmations of Nicaea made little difference in the face of this violence meted out across the world, firstly on the indigenous pre-Columbian peoples and latterly African enslaved persons and their descendants. This calls for a new way of doing theology, a different way, a way of engaging in ecumenical dialogue that takes this pervasive reality seriously. I argue for a decolonial approach, and I suggest that such an approach can function in ways to get us to see ourselves, encounter ourselves, because we don't change unless we look ourselves in the mirror. It functions to help the church make an inward journey of self-analysis and repentance. A decolonial approach seems a precondition for more fruitful ecumenical conversation. I thank you.
A very big thank you to all of our speakers for some very rich presentations full of thought and challenge for us today to kind of examine our histories and be self-reflective about the dynamics of power at work in our churches and among us today. We started late and we're running out of time, so we'll only have time for one question, which I'll address to both speakers, but do speak to them over coffee if you have more. So just for both of you, what does unity look like in the light of the issues raised in our three presentations?
I think for me, unity, if we would unite, because we are going through very, very challenging times, politically, globally, and we can see what politics is doing to every single nation, either near us or at distance from us. Those who have already political theologies and those who do not have are finding the same challenges. Maybe unity would be coming up with a new political ecclesiology, a new political theology that would cross from east, west, south, north, that all churches would think through about so that we can be assisted on the way forward.
I was so pleased to encounter Brother Moses the Black and to learn of St. Macarius. These things I've read of in history, and I am happy and privileged to encounter so many different people. I start there because unity means that I don't need to be you, but we can find each other in the depth of who we are. But there's a humility to bring me into you even though you feel I may threaten you. I think this is the Jesus way. I think this is the Trinitarian way. Unity does not mean uniformity. Uniformity is a colonial construct. May we find ways to deeply encounter each other. That's what I hope for.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's been a real privilege to hear all of you, including our speaker on the screen. We'll now move towards coffee, but can I ask all of you to be back here for the next session in time, so that we can have plenty of time to explore our topics. Thank you.
المحبة لا تسقط أبدا.
نعم نسألك إلى المسيح إلهنا